Well, I'd like to welcome Jay Bloom with me to this afternoon for our session of Bourbon with Generations that can legally drink or not drink. And so we're actually discussing all of the generational aspects with each generation and guests from those generational components. So, Jay, thank you and welcome.
Thank you.
And first of all, what generation are you in, Jay?
I would be in the boomer generation.
Boomer generation.
Born in 1951.
Oh, right there with you on the right there. So we're both boomers, so we can give a pretty good perspective on this. What is the general philosophy, your general philosophy on aging as a boomer?
Well, my thoughts on that is I was asked to speak to a group not too long ago, and on what the topic was, what would be the attributes of successful aging?
Mm-hmm.
And it came to me the word acme, and acme I originally thought was just do with Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, but acme is a real word. And it means the apex or pinnacle of something.
Mm-hmm.
And I take those four letters, and the A stands for attitude. And my belief is, regardless of age, your attitude is critical. Do you feel like you have some agency, that you can do you have some influence over your life, regardless of circumstance? So the first letter would be A. The C.
And Jay, that's interesting, because when I talked to a millennial previously, they brought up the age. For them, is mind is one component of aging, and body. So attitude is what they were talking about. And that generation are the ones that are actually born through 1981 to 1996. So I thought that was kind of interesting that they had a little perspective like that as well.
So the A, A could also stand for, if you didn't attitude, could be adaptation.
Uh-huh.
How do you adapt, in fact, to your present circumstances? The C for me stands for connection. Relationships, and particularly personal and familial relationships. That's nothing's more of a detriment, I think, at any stage of life than isolation. And so the C stands for connection. M for me in ACME is meaning or purpose. I've heard more people say, particularly as they age, I have to have some reason to get up in the morning. I have to have some purpose, some meaning. And then E for me stands for exercise, for both the mind and the body.
Mm-hmm.
The philosophy, use it or lose it. So with those four key ingredients, those are my philosophy on how to age well.
Great.
Acme.
Acme. That's a great way of looking at aging and to determine that. So what do you think about the name boomer for our generation?
Well, it's become somewhat of a lightning rod for controversy at times.
Mm-hmm.
Whether in fact we were a generous generation or whether we've just been all about I.
Mm-hmm.
Clearly, probably more than any other generation, it's been studied and is used in the media quite a bit. The problem I have with the term is that there's just tremendous diversity within
Mm-hmm.
that. The old philosophy, the old thought is, you meet one 60-year-old, you've met one 60-year-old. You can find a 60-year-old that's fairly struggling with physical issues. You can find a 60-year-old who's a grandparent. You can find a 60-year-old who's just starting to be a parent.
Right.
So it's not as much of a descriptor anymore where you are in that generation.
I've heard the term transitional generation in discussing some things with folks, and what they're talking about is we were the first generation to go from non-technology to technology. So we transitioned, and other generations have been able to build upon that success that our generation had in technology. So I think the boomer itself and connotation of that is a little misleading. And I think you brought that very pointedly with the 60-year-old analysis. So I think that's great. One of the things when we talk to the younger generations about the boomer generation, their take on us is very diversified. And one of the things I talked to one of the millennials about was it's the I versus the me type of philosophy that we're taking but not contributing back. How would you do you view that the same, or how can we, if you do, how can we change that perception?
And how can we change that perception is definitely a big question. I'm not sure I accept that assumption, because I go back in our lifetime, and our generation was very active in civil rights and gay rights and environmental consciousness, anti-war. There was a fair amount of initially kind of groups consciousness. I think with time, some of that has evaporated. And I think that's generally true in our overall culture, not just for the boomers, where I think there's clearly a challenge today on how much are people thinking in terms of an I statement, smaller and smaller tribes versus our interdependence with others. I want to tack back before I forget it, your statement about a transition generation around technology. And I think it depends on how you define technology. So I can remember starting off working with a manual typewriter. And then there was a typewriter that had a little bit of memory in it. And then there was a computer that had a little bit of software in it, and so on and so forth. So there's been an evolution of technology, pretty much in all generations. I remember my grandfather, who was born in 1899 and was a farmer from Sweden, and he first farmed with horses. And when he finally retired, he was definitely doing a mechanical tractor. Right. And all the evolution in farm machinery, whatever. So I agree that we've had a lot of transition in the last few years. The iPhone itself, I think, only being only 10 years old. But each generation, I think, has had their challenges in how they navigate the evolution of different tools.
So what do you think our generation has contributed for other generations?
Well, I touched on that earlier a little bit with some of the social justice, very early being a part of that. I mean, given the turbulence of the last couple of years, probably one of the key similar periods that people often refer to is like 1968, which was a very turbulent year that had both the assassination of Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy, the Chicago Democratic Convention. There was just a lot of turmoil and whatnot during that period of time. But I think that those concerns around social justice were very active in that period, and I think have continued. Excuse me. The environmental movement, I think, was very much a part of those early years as well.
Right. So why do you think that our generation hasn't been advocating for aging in the same way they did back in 68, changing how we take care of older Americans and older individuals?
A term that I think is going to become even more prominent in the upcoming years, given the size of our demographic, is just the whole realization of the negative effects of ageism. Ageism, it's one of the most uniform isms that we still all have. The best definition I heard of that not too long ago was ageism is prejudice against our future self. And you would ask anyone who's an older person, almost regardless of age, they're going to pick somebody 10 years older than they are. I can remember my father, who lived to 87, when he's 80 years old, delivering Meals on Wheels to the old people.
Right.
At 80, he didn't consider himself old. So there's just a denial to some degree that we're all aging from birth.
Right.
And that it's a normal part of the life cycle. I think also in the media, it's one of the last areas that still has active ageism, where there's the making fun of older folks, etc. Ironically, our current president is 79.
Yeah.
Ironically, Betty White just died last week, and she was 99 and considered a very hip kind of person with tons of followers, etc. So we're in that transition of older adults living longer and more engaged and healthier.
Do you know, one of the interesting things is I interviewed True Ware of the Generation Z, which is born between 1997 and 2012. And she said that one of the things that they needed to work on was discrimination against ageism. And this is from that generation. So I think it's really interesting that that younger generation is picking up on the ageism side of things as well. What do you, with being so vocal back in the 60s, the boomer generation, why haven't we advocated for more treatment, like for Alzheimer's, dementia, better medical treatments, better housing for seniors, and that sort of thing? Is there maybe something to do?
Again, I would say it's not something we have in our consciousness.
Okay.
You know, it's not something we want to think about.
Right.
There's you know, some folks have suggested that it's all tied to our sense of mortality and death, and that we haven't really been okay talking about that in our normal culture.
Right.
You think of all the topics we do talk about, but the fact that human beings have a finite lifespan is not one of those topics. So
Right.
we all owe God a death, as they say.
Yeah.
And I just think there's just a reluctance to talk about that in any way, shape, or form.
No, I think that's very correct. I'm just kind of taken back when I look at the treatments for Alzheimer's disease, for example. We just came out with a new drug that is somewhat effective, but not truly effective, if I'm reading things correctly. $36,000 a year for treatment. And it's the first new drug, I think, in 10 years or longer. And so it's just really mind-boggling to me that our generation hasn't used the same type of activism that we did in the 68 to make sure that we have these things available, since it affects our generation so much. It's just interesting to me.
I think one of the hopeful areas, Gary, in regards to that, is that the aging of adults on the planet is a worldwide phenomenon. It's not just a U.S. phenomenon. Mm-hmm. So, you know, it's rapidly impacting, you know, countries, whether it's China, Japan, Europe, Canada, et cetera. And so I think we're going to have much more of a collective consciousness of both the opportunities and challenges of people living longer. Yeah. And clearly Alzheimer's, I think, will be one of those areas where there's going to be a fair amount of, I think, investment and attention, particularly for the pharmaceutical and the biotech companies, on how, in fact, we can address that going forward. Right. Now, how quickly they will be effective, I'm not sure in any way, shape, or form, but I'm pretty confident it's not just going to be segmented to the US.
Right. I think most of the Alzheimer's research is coming from other countries, not the U.S. And so I think that's you're correct. In the collective consciousness, we're all having to deal with this as society matures, not by age, that we need to address that. Um, I know you work on and have developed aging plans. So how does the aging plan take into effect the pure number of boomers that we have coming on board?
Well, for me, the key is recognizing the both longevity, how long people live, and how many health years they have. For me, how many healthy years. The fancy technical term is compression of morbidity or active life expectancy. So it's one thing to live to age 90 and still have a pretty vital and engaged life. It's quite another to have to live to age 90, and those 10 years of that has been suffering and et cetera.
Right.
So I think the key for me is how can we increase active life expectancy? What are the key ingredients we can help people? And again, I go back to that ACME word, to the degree that we encourage people to have agency, that aging isn't necessarily just a series of losses, but there are gains in that as well. Emotional intelligence, experience, perspective, a much more appreciation of the complexity of life, a number of gains. To the degree that we keep people engaged and not isolated. Used to be one of our goals was to age in place. Now I think a stronger approach would be to age in community. How do we help support people to stay engaged in relationships? And that meaning and purpose is huge. It's just not a matter of how to live longer physically and emotionally, but to what degree does a person have a purpose, that they're still needed. And frankly, again, how do we continue to reinforce the need to exercise, physically and mentally, and keep our brains growing, as we're finding out scientifically that the brain can add synapses right up to the day you die.
Right.
So, we're not organized. We don't think of that. For the most part, our formal systems at the federal level, the state level, and the local level, for the most part, are all organized around a deficit model of deterioration versus how do we optimize so that we can help people live longer, better. How can we help them thrive? And so that would be my key area.
Absolutely. Someone just sent me a statistical data that baby boomers are working 9 years longer than they used to. And I think that is probably true from the ones that I know that are part of the baby boomer generation. They tend to be working longer. Do you think that contributes to a little bit of the ACME model that you described earlier?
Again, it's always, you're always vulnerable when you start to generalize. I think again, people work sometimes for social reasons. Sometimes I think people often work because they have to. One of the downsides of living longer is you need more income. You need to work longer in order to support the cost of living longer.
Right.
But again, the boomer generation has been pointed out is the most educated older cohort that we've ever had. And so a number of those folks aren't ready physically, mentally, whatever, to stop working. They want to continue to contribute. And in many cases, they're on the top of their game. in terms of their capabilities, whenever. Again,
There's a
regardless of where you are on the political spectrum, both our last two presidents have been in their 70s.
right. And I had a discussion earlier about how it seems like that the boomer generation is just staying on instead of seeing themselves as needing to leave in the political arena specifically and allow younger generations to come forth or mentoring them a little bit. And that's what the millennials are saying, is that at some point we have to turn the torch over to you know, younger
I mean,
generation.
the political one may be true. I think in other settings, in the private, governmental, and philanthropic sectors, I think older adults many of them are interested in other roles than just being in charge.
Right.
Where they may very well be interested in more of a part-time role,
Right.
or in a more informal mentoring role, so that they don't necessarily assume that an older adult always wants to be the one in charge.
Yeah, I think the political arena is probably the not the best exception to the rule. You're absolutely correct. What do you think our generation could have done better for future generations?
Well, I think whether it was, I don't know if it was truly intentional, but other authorities better than me have pointed out that we've evolved in a much more segregated living than we used to. Historically, there was much more multi-generational living in communities. And I think maybe unintentionally, we didn't realize that when we created, some of these retirement communities in Florida and Arizona, we just further exacerbated age segregation rather than thinking more comprehensive. I was on a school board in Massachusetts in the 70s, and I think a big mistake was not realizing, with the evolution of lifelong learning, we didn't think of schools as more of community centers versus just for, from primary to secondary education. It's a mistake now to think that a kid who graduates from high school is not going to be needing education throughout their lifetime. And I think that's true for anyone now, any boomer who's in their 60s or early 70s. The next 20 years, there's going to be a lot of learning opportunities.
I'm sure there is. Absolutely correct on that.
And our institutions, if we say that we've been the principal architects of the current institutions, we're really not designed that way. I know most college presidents have not thought about their institutions trying to attract all generations, not just a younger generation.
Well, that's interesting. And I've been asking, the question is, do you have friends, not family, friends in other generations that you discuss things with or talk to them about?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. That it's, there's a fellow by the name of Chip Conley who wrote a book, The Modern Elder, and he had a chapter in that. He was worked with the two young founders in their 20s. He was in their 50s. He now has turned 60. But in his early 50s, these two young folks in their 20s approached him and said, we have a model for a super technology, but we don't know the hospitality industry or how to bring things to scale. And they asked him to be the chief strategy officer. And it was for a company that became Airbnb. And he wrote a chapter in this book, The Modern Elder, that said, I was a mentern. I was both a mentor and an intern. I mentored the younger generation around emotional intelligence and things of that nature. They mentored me as an intern on some of the technology and other tools.
Sure.
So I think that the key part of that message is the mutual learning. And I'm very pleased to have a number of folks throughout the generation that mentor me, or I intern with them, and vice versa, that they get something from me.
the same here. I have friends across the generational, and it's amazing what you pick up from those generations on that one. I've just finished a book called The Raised Us. You Raised Us, Now Work With Us, Millennials, Career Successes, and Building Strong Workplace Teams. And it's by Lauren Stiller Rickman. And it was really interesting to me to see how actually the Gen X is more lumped in with the baby boomers in their perception by millennials and the Z. But one of the things is that the millennials are really kind of united with boomers in that they kind of want to maintain the status quo. And that was one of the things that she brought out. And I thought that was very different. So on the millennials, do you get the same concept that she did in her book, that millennials are a little more united with boomers than we think they are?
You know, again, I'm not an academic, so I'm not going to put out anything authoritative on that.
Well,
I think some are and some aren't.
Okay.
In that regards, I do believe you're right that the Generation X do really feel in the middle, and the irony again, back to that ageism issue we discussed earlier, it's occurring at a younger and younger age.
Mm-hmm.
So you're finding a number of folks in their late 30s as they're about to turn 40, whatever, particularly in the technology field, where they're starting to feel discriminated that they're too old.
Right.
Now, when people 40 years old start to feel that, it's getting younger. Yeah. And then vice versa, the younger generation, the folks in their early 20s, whatever, they often feel discriminated, as we will remember that old thing, you don't have any experience.
Right.
And then you say, well, how do I get experience if I don't get a job? So that was always a catch-22 growing up is, we want to hire somebody with experience, but then you don't give them the opportunity to experience it.
Right.
I do believe, Gary, without a doubt, and I was having lunch with a CEO today, you're going to see workplaces very much involving 3 generations going forward, if not 4. Mm-hmm. And I think it will be one of the fastest growing areas around diversity. We've stepped up quite a bit our awareness and investment around diversity, around race, sexual orientation, et cetera. But I think the fastest growing area of diversity training going forward is going to be, how do you work in multiple generations?
Right.
What's it like to be a 20-year-old managing somebody who could be the age of your parent or your grandfather? What's it like to be the aunt being managed by, younger, and vice versa? So I just think that's going to be a tremendous opportunity as we, again, face a labor shortage going mm-hmm. forward, where we're going to need to retain and recruit older adults much more vigorously than we have in the past to be in the workforce.
Right.
So they're all going to be there.
That's a great point, because even with my company here, we have generational. There's at least three generations here. And it is an interesting task having to manage 3 generations and put my mindset into not being, to look at that generation and not have any judgment on the generation and say each individual is different. They bring certain strengths to the corporation and to the firm, and we need to honor that and build upon them. But we also need to mentor them. And I think that's the key to working in the generational thing, is to see myself as being older, more of a mentor role than anything.
And then, as I said earlier, like Chip Conway says, and be humble enough and recognize that there's learnings there as well.
There is.
And I think that's true for any form of diversity. I mean, I love an old Will Rogers quote. And you know me well enough that if I didn't throw in at least one quote in this, it wouldn't be authentic.
That's true.
Will said, everyone's ignorant only on different subjects. And I think the opposite of that is so true as well. Everyone's smart only on different subjects. And that's the value of a diversified work team, is that enriches it with the multiple intelligences.
Absolutely. One of the discussions I had with the millennial generation was, and I'm calling them the rebel generation because I think they're going to change up the work environment, because they're wanting to work less, be more adventurous and play more. So I don't see them going into the status quo of our generation where we work 40 hours, we have 2 weeks of vacation a year, and that sort of thing in doing it. But that was interesting that that's one of the concepts I've learned is you have to be able to allow individuals to grow within their space, and working the 40 and 60 hours a week is 60 hours a week is not beneficial to anyone. And so that generation, I think, is going to really push the envelope on that.
Yes, and I think subsequent as well. I mean, there's a professor at Stanford University, Laura Carstensen, who's done a lot of work on what she calls the 100-year life, and that old model of, you get educated, you work, and then you retire as a sequence is going to get blown up. If you've got 60 years potential work productivity, et cetera. I think there's going to be a lot more intermittent stages where people will take sabbaticals. They'll move horizontally, not always just one up the ladder. And I think companies are recognizing that they're having to have much more individualized conversations with their employees as to what their expectations and goals are.
Right.
And whether it's to take time off to have a child, or to pursue some education or some other attribute. That type of flexibility, I think, is going to be increasingly a premium that all ages are going to want to pursue. I know it's true in the older generation, and I think you're seeing it in the younger ones as well. They want that flexibility.
Well, my guest on the millennials was Connor Kavanaugh, and one of the things he pointed out is you're not going to see us stay with the same company like our grandparents and parents did for 30 years. It's just not going to happen. And one of the interesting things is he said, we won't do retirement parties. And I laughed and I said, what do you mean by that? And he said, we're going to be moving horizontal and moving. And so we're never going to retire. And I thought, well, that is a good concept, because I really don't see me having a retirement party. I might leave one job and do something else, but I wouldn't see them doing that. But I think that's interesting that generation is looking at the horizontal move a little differently than our generation did. So,
oh, you're absolutely right. But I would also add that some of that's also dictated by the approach employers have taken. So you and I are old enough to remember that it used to be a standard. There were defined benefit retirement programs that often rewarded employees for staying longer to get a pension, et cetera. And then the 401k was introduced initially as a supplement to those pensions. And then fairly quickly, outside of the public sector, which still has to some degree those defined benefit programs, it's now pretty much dependent upon the individual to have to save for their own retirement. And so your regular employer becomes less of a contributor to that. That combined with the fact that almost all companies now offer some form of health insurance makes it more mobile. That and the Affordable Care Plan helps that mobility as well. So I think we will continue to reinforce that type of fluidity going forward rather than the long-term employer role.
So I know we've talked a little bit about the generation, so I want to go through and talk a little bit about perception the baby boomers might have about other generations. And so we've talked a lot about the millennials. So what do you think our perception is, or your perception is, of the millennial generation?
Again, Gary, I really resist the the segmenting that way, because it's
Okay.
my experience has been as much as possible to set those assumptions on a shelf somewhere, because I have found that each person has such an individual story
Right.
that and that it's better to approach them as an individual than it is the characterized. Now, again, I would say, a couple of millennials who grew up in a rural community may have things in common
Hmm.
versus a couple of millennials who grew up in an urban setting.
Right.
They're going to have a different experience if that rural setting is in, say, Mississippi versus Oregon. So the diversity, I think, in so many ways, each of us,
Hmm.
regardless of where we are in our age, is literally becoming more individualized all the time, and less chances of being able to categorize or put in a category. We remember, again, during the Vietnam War, that there were veterans who came back who were very anti-war.
Hmm.
And then there were veterans who came back and were very supportive of the war. So you couldn't necessarily say, well, they're a pro-military or an anti-military. Good example in relatively recent history was John Kerry, who was a former senator and secretary of state. Now I think the ambassador for Biden for environmental issues. He came back very much an anti-war
Hmm.
advocate. Um, so I know your program's trying to tease those out, but I don't go there. It's
Okay.
maybe it's because all the years of just trying to avoid those stereotypes of women do this, men do that, heterosexuals do that. It's just it's
You,
just uh, it's been pretty much nah, because every time I've done that, an exception comes up and says, "Oh no,
yeah.
it's a wrong assumption."
Well, I think that's a great point, and I really appreciate that take on it. It's something that I hadn't thought about a little bit. But by talking about the generations and how we do it, it's interesting with me the Z generation individual, True Ware, that I interviewed for that segment, was saying we need to find things of more common ground instead of the negative aspects of it. And I thought, that's really where we need to go. So I need to rethink how we're doing our discussions with folks about what are the common grounds that we can reach. Uh, for her, ageism was one of them. And here is a person that is in that Z group. What do you think are some common grounds that we can all have across the generations?
I think some of those are similar to the movements that were back in the 60s. So let's
Hmm.
start with the environment. I think, climate change and our current, what kind of world are we living in currently from an environmental standpoint, and how do we reinforce sustainability for not only while we're living but for future generations. I think that's probably one area that's extremely common. I think there could be commonality around inequities in so many areas of whether it's the poverty or racism or you know nonviolence. I think there are a number of areas that we have a common agenda on. I think the whole commitment to eliminating barriers unnecessarily, whether that's in education, whether that's in employment, uh, whether that's in access to healthcare. I think those are all, I think, potentially common agendas.
Hmm.
Um, I'm 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 hopeful that this virus that we've been experiencing over the last couple of years has definitely increased our sense of interdependence, not just in the United States, but even more importantly, how interdependent we are in the greater world. Uh, we still have in the United States, on all our generations in the United States, a little bit of a parochialism.
Mhm.
We think if we get all vaccinated and boosters, we're going to be okay. Well, I'll tell you, in an interdependent world, until the majority of the planet is vaccinated, we're going to be at risk
Mhm.
because the virus will continue to mutate in other places. So our awareness on the health area more interdependent, the climate more interdependent, and economically, even now, the supply chain through so many of our products and services is an interdependent one.
So
So
I
I
know
think
you.
those are common. I mean, they're,
Right.
each of those, the power goes out in Texas during a winter storm. It doesn't really care what age you are.
Right. Right. And I know you have grandchildren. So, what would be some advice from a boomer to? There's a new generation out there called Alpha, which I wasn't familiar, born 2013 through
Hmm.
2025. So, what advice would you give that very young generation or Gen Z?
It would be to some degree the same advice I would give any person at any age.
Okay.
And I would say this has become clearer to me the older I've gotten. The serenity prayer of focus on what you can influence and be aware of what you can't, and the wisdom to know that difference.
Right.
Because your sense of agency, what you can impact, and back to that attitude, reinforce your what you're able to do versus falling into the trap of feeling like, well, I'm victimized with this. There's no question the environment's it's gonna continue to be uncertain. Again, regardless of age. Um, we have the world's greatest scientists working right now on the virus. And I'll tell you, the most consistent message in 2.5 years is almost every one of them at different points have said, we don't know. We
Exactly.
don't know. We've been behind the curve. We've never been ahead of our knowledge about it. We didn't even know about Omicron when Delta emerged.
Right.
And so the uncertainty is going to be a regular part of your life going forward. And so you can stand on the sidelines and feel victimized by that, or you can say, okay, what areas can I impact?
Right.
And I get back to some degree that Acme proposition, because you don't want to be isolated. You want to have some purpose and meaning, and probably the other key advice, regardless of age, is those who see a purpose outside of themselves tend to do better. They tend to thrive better.
Absolutely. And I think that's a great way of describing how future generations need to take what they can take away from the boomers and from our generation. One of the things that I think and I do when I do Uber, I always ask people, what's your philosophy on aging and what do you think of other generations and sort of thing? Because Uber drivers go from baby boomers down to Z. And one of the things that they're mentioning about our generation is that we've become extremely more conservative as we've aged, and that we're not understanding that we had the benefit of a cheaper education, especially post secondary, and that we were able to live on one salary, one parent salaries, and still buy a house and do all the things. And it's changed, and why we're not willing to invest in their future by doing the same thing. Do you think that's a fair analysis of our generation?
There's no question that we had policies that we put into place that we benefited,
Mm-hmm.
and that some populations did not benefit. I mean, the clarity now that I think around the housing redlining that used to occur was a clear policy of discriminating. On the other hand, the GI Bill for many folks was a tremendous plus
Right.
for their education and housing capabilities. So yes, I think we definitely benefited from those times of defined benefit programs, cheaper education, cheaper interest rates, et cetera. And quite frankly, it's my philosophy that older generations both owe more to younger generations, as well as younger generations need to respect and value the contributions of older adults. Right. So it's very much an interdependent one. But I would hope that the goal of my generation would not be how do I sit on the sidelines and watch the daily travails of life and feel like their work is done. I would hope they think there's still opportunity for them to contribute and are needed to do so.
Right. Well, I think it's interesting because when talking to my mom, who turned 92 in November 25th, when I talk about with her a little bit about what did her generation, and she's in the silent generation, what do you think your contributions were? And she said, we didn't avoid paying taxes. And I think that kind of sums it up a little bit, because that generation paid higher taxes than we do currently, but they felt it was very important to subsidize higher education, subsidize, in the Eisenhower's administration, the freeway and the interstate system, to really do some of those things. And I think maybe the boomer generation has lost sight of that. They knew the importance that the only way you're going to be able to succeed is by helping others, and you needed to help others by paying taxes. But I was very surprised that she relayed that to me, and I went, yeah, you're right. So I think that that's one of the keys that maybe our generation has not really thought about with that. Everyone keeps cutting taxes instead of getting, paying for the services for future generations.
I'm reminded, Gary, of the concern I had back in 1980 when Ronald Reagan became president, and for the first time, he sold the country and I grew up in the Midwest, where there was a lot of what I would call moderate Republicans. They were socially liberal and fiscally conservative. And if there was one thing I heard more than anything else, was the maxim, there's no free lunch. You don't get something for nothing. And it was in 1980 that he sold you could cut taxes and spend more for the military, and the budget would balance. And ever since 1980, I have not seen in either party, Republican or Democrat, any message of, in order to get X, you have to pay Y. And it's a natural denial mechanism, as somebody who's a psychology background, for people to want to believe there is a free lunch. I can win the lottery, whatever. I don't have to save for my retirement. I can just buy a lottery ticket. But that's a fool's choice.
Right.
And we need to get back to, you get what you pay for, and that there's a value in paving the way for other generations, because other generations benefited you. I mean, your parents, my parents, our grandparents, they sacrificed in order for us to have the bounty we have now.
Right.
Not everyone has the bounty, but for those that do, I think we owe it to return, as you know, my word, returnment, return back some of those blessings that we received.
Absolutely. Well, Jay, I want to thank you so much for being part of our discussion, and your insights are greatly appreciated. And it was great to have this opportunity for us to discuss aging and our generation, baby boomers. Thank you.
Well, I have to leave you with my favorite quote, or one of my favorites, Gary. Okay. That's by Einstein, that said, all theories are wrong, but some are useful. So whatever, everything I said might have been wrong, but whatever is useful, hope your audience can find it useful.
I think they will, Jeff. Well, I owe you a bourbon.